Our Red Army is a brave army, like our people, invincible in battle. From the British coast to Siberia, the Red Army is the strongest in the world. Listening to the familiar song playing in my ear again, I watched the T34 medium tank and T14 Amata main battle tank rumbling side by side under the observation deck in front of me. Lin Jie, who was immersed in excitement as a melon-eating crowd and military fan holding a camera, would not know that a great patriotic war, praising countless legends and glories, was slowly approaching. Hardcore armored war article, no harem stallion, everything is strictly scrutinized with genuine materials, welcome to enter the pit, keywords of the novel. Steel Soviet Union without pop-ups, Steel Soviet Union. Download the complete set of TXT, and read the latest chapters of Steel Soviet Union. Chapter 1. May Moscow. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. May Moscow. In early May, Moscow was still immersed in the tale of winter and the rustling sound of the cold wind, which made people feel a bit trembling. As a Chinese military enthusiast and staunch fan of the Soviet Union, Lin Jie's purpose for this trip to Moscow is very clear, which is to hold a grand military parade commemorating the Victory Day of the Patriotic War in Moscow on May 9 this year. In order not to miss out on every crucial detail of this rare event, Lin Jie, who woke up early at 4 a.m., packed his bags and lined up outside the Moscow Red Square with the stars and night sky above his head. In order to capture the most gimmicky and cool photos at the best viewing location and send them back to China to show off, in order to satisfy my small vanity. After waiting for a long time with a feeling of unease and excitement, in the familiar melody of the song, The Strongest Red Army, that made people yearn for memories and glory year after year, the biggest highlight of the Victory Day parade and also the most exciting and anticipated armored formation for Lin Jie, finally began to slowly drive along the flat road towards the observation deck, dragging the black engine exhaust with the characteristics of a bear. Sleeping slot. T3485. Active, living T3485. Damn it, those little brats must envy me. Haha. T72B3. This is great. We also need to take a picture of the turtle shell head, which is the iconic feature of the bear. Here we go. 2 S-35 self-propelled howitzers and 2 S-19. Grass, they're so beautiful. As a fellow friend who helped Lin Jie secure tickets for the military parade this time, as a genuine Russian citizen and descendant of the Soviet Red Army, Rozov Vlavich Lavrenenko was somewhat puzzled by Lin Jie's enthusiasm while holding a camera and constantly taking photos. Lin, your Chinese army is also very strong now. Why did you come back from afar 2 years after graduating from Moscow University to watch the Victory Day parade? Upon hearing a question from his classmate who was studying abroad in college, Lin Jie put down his camera for the time being and smiled heartily at the corner of his mouth. He immediately spoke up. What's wrong with this, Comrade Rossov? You should know that the anti-fascist war is the fruit of our common victory. Aren't you willing to share this joy with me? My dear Dwerich. When it comes to lip service, I think there is no country in the world where people from any country can compete with you Chinese people. The heartfelt enthusiasm and laughter from the fighting nation easily resolved this small conversation. Before Rossov, who had just regained his composure, continued to speak, Lin Jie, who had been holding onto his camera tightly, suddenly exclaimed in a low voice again. Worry, here we are. It's the T14 Amata and Kurgan 25 infantry tank. Why is this garbage camera so useless at this time? Regardless of whether the gains of the day made Lin Jie feel perfect and satisfied, a slightly rushed and busy day will eventually come to an end in the afterglow of the sunset. Lying flat on the bed of the hotel, he took out a small box temporarily borrowed from his old classmate Rossov to enjoy and carefully opened it. Immediately before Lin Jie's eyes was a genuine Sioux League hero medal worth all hardcore Sioux fans crazy about. The Soviet hero medal that appears in Lin Jie's hands at this moment is not a cheap and crude counterfeit. It is already a legitimate Soviet Hero Medal awarded to Rozov's great-grandfather on May 5, 1990, by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. During the Patriotic War, the Soviets' #1 tank ace, Dmitry Fyodorovich Lavrenenko, was wearing 52 German tanks that destroyed their records. It is not easy to pass down this legendary military medal, which symbolizes the highest honor of Soviet soldiers, to this day. In the second year of posthumously awarding the Soviet Hero Medal to the descendants of Lavrenenko, the once formidable and powerful Red Soviet Empire, which was able to compete with the entire NATO led by the United States, finally collapsed due to its internal irreconcilable institutional flaws and increasing contradictions. What was left for the Soviet people was infinite nostalgia for that once powerful motherland and the overnight life difficulties that plummeted to the bottom. In that era of great turmoil and collapse of faith, Rozov's father, who was so hungry that almost his entire family couldn't afford to eat, wanted several times to sell off the Soviet Heroic Military Medal, which symbolized the legendary military achievements and supreme glory of his ancestors, in exchange for some basic bread and food to make a living. But in the end, after multiple intense psychological struggles, he defeated his own father, Rozov. In the end, he chose to keep this Soviet Hero Medal and led his family through the most difficult years after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Hero Medal, which was awarded in the last year before the disintegration of the Soviet Union, has clearly become the most proud and boastful treasure of Rozov. Even Lin Jie, who spent his years in college drinking vodka and fooling around with this guy all day, finally took advantage of the Victory Day parade and borrowed this genuine Soviet Hero Medal from Rozov to play with and admire it carefully after some hard work and lip service. Weighing the fact that over 90% of the material in his hand was a heavy metal made of pure gold, Lin Jie seemed to be able to see the posthumous recipient of this medal, Lavrenenko, commanding the T34 medium tank to bravely charge towards the German armored unit on the war-torn Eastern Front. Witnessing the imprints of the era before him and feeling deeply moved, Lin Jie carefully placed the Soviet Hero Medal back in the storage box after taking photos as a souvenir. After collecting it, he put it back in the cabinet by his bedside and checked it for accuracy. Let's return this thing to Rozov tomorrow. Even if there is a magnitude 9 earthquake now, I don't think we can wake up this guy. Like most Russian men who claim to be fighting ethnicities, Rozov, who is in his prime, is also a great old man who loves vodka and alcohol pleasure. This guy, who doesn't have a good tolerance and taste for alcohol, has an almost crazy obsession with vodka. Almost every time he drinks 2 bottles of vodka, this young and flushed old furry guy will sway and fall asleep on the bed. Unless he slowly wakes up after his own drunkenness subsides, the only way to wake up this guy is to give him a thorough shower with a large bucket of ice water mixed with ice cubes. Listening to the piercing snoring of Rozov from the neighboring room, which was particularly jarring against the background of the quiet room, Lin Jie fell asleep slowly. It was obvious that he had been tired and busy all day on this special day, and it was time for him to take a good rest. What he didn't expect was that a sudden change that could change his future life trajectory began to occur from this moment on. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Battle. Barbarossa. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Battle. Barbarossa. Lieutenant Malashenko, wake up, wake up. Lieutenant Comrade, the German tank is charging towards us. Please tell us what to do quickly. Is someone talking in their own room? Or Russian? From his sleep, he vaguely heard 2 tall Slavic men shouting loudly at him in his ear. Suddenly realizing that the situation was not right, Lin Jie cleverly opened his eyes from his sleep. Sukabul. That bastard dares to steal things from me in my room. Hurry up before I break your dog legs. The loud cries that were made while subconsciously opening their eyes suddenly came to an abrupt end due to the unfamiliar and cold scene before them. On the cold steel bulkhead in front of him, black and white photos of an unknown girl were casually pasted with tape. The huge bolt, with a slight smell of gunpowder, appeared in the area close to Lin Jie's ear. The turbid air mixed with the strong smell of diesel almost instantly choked Lin Jie to the point of coughing. This unfamiliar and inexplicable thing was enough to make Lin Jie feel confused and at a loss when he woke up from his sleep. I'm supposed to be in a hotel room, aren't I his mother? Tie a meat ticket to a sleeper. Where the hell is this? Shocked by the unfamiliar environment he was in at the moment, he looked around and instinctively wanted to lift his left hand to pinch his face and ask if he was dreaming. However, what his left hand touched closely behind him scared Lin Jie so much that he couldn't lose his soul. Damn it! Why is there a dead person here, lying down? I was shocked to see the mottled warm blood stains on my left wrist. A headless corpse, still warm and bleeding, sat side by side weakly leaning against the cabin wall next to his seat. Feeling deeply shocked, Lin Jie gazed at the familiar uniform on the headless corpse. Despite the dim light inside the car, it was still enough for him to recognize the military uniform worn by the corpse in front of him, which was the standard attire of the Soviet armored forces in the early stages of World War II. As the highest surviving officer in the vehicle, located at the loader's position, hesitated to respond, the two tank crew members in the driver's position and the mechanic's position inside the chassis once again spoke loudly to the officer in their eyes. Lieutenant Comrade. What should we do now? The Germans' tanks are less than 500 meters away from us. German. Tank. Upon hearing the urgent cries emanating from the chassis below him, and recalling the headless body next to him in Soviet armored uniform, Lin Jie looked around at the narrow and compact steel bulkheads that made it difficult to even turn around in place. Suddenly, he realized where he was, and a very bad conclusion suddenly arose in his heart. You guys, wait a moment, I need to observe the situation before making a decision. Lin Jie, who spoke confidently and doubtfully towards the two members under his seat and the chassis, replied. He couldn't believe the terrifying conclusion he had in his heart. Lin Jie then stood up from his seat, pushed open the heavy turret hatch above his head with a difficult and unfamiliar hunched posture, and followed closely behind, protruding his entire upper body out of the car. Shio, bang. Kaka. The pungent smell of battlefield gunpowder mixed with the howling of shells and the continuous loud explosions around him struck Lin Jie's senses with the most realistic posture. He looked at the iron-gray tanks flying towards him in groups of 3 or 5 in the distance, and then lowered his head to look at the sharp and smooth tall turret beneath him. Although I am still extremely unwilling to admit this cruel fact in my heart, all the real and cruel things at present are telling Lin Jie an incredibly shocking conclusion. I'm afraid I have traveled through it, and what I have traveled to is the most brutal and life-consuming Eastern Soviet German battlefield during the entire Second World War. Holding on to the tank cap on his forehead, he sat heavily back in his position as a loader inside the turret, as if he had completely collapsed. Lin Jie, who was lost in his wits, not only understood through his observation of his upper body protruding out of the turret just now, that he was on the war-torn Soviet-German battlefield on the Eastern Front, it was through a simple identification at a glance that I knew the true model of the Soviet tank I was currently in. The T34 76 medium tank 1941. At the moment when Lin Jie was sitting inside the turret, his brain suddenly froze and he was momentarily lost in thought. A piercing armor shell roared out of the barrel of a German tank that had stopped moving forward and was firing. Ding-bang, accompanied by a dull impact sound of a piercing armor warhead hitting the upper armor plate area at the front of the tank body, the T34 76 tank, which was in a stationary state, immediately shook the eardrums of all 3 surviving members in the car with a trembling huge echo. This round came from a 75mm full-caliber hooded armor-piercing shell fired from a German Type 4C tank 500 meters away, which failed to penetrate the sturdy armor area on the front of the T-34 76 tank and produced a jump shot that was directly ejected. The weakness of the 75mm KWK 37-24 caliber short-barreled main gun equipped on the early Type 4 tank in dealing with armored units is now evident. Although I still have doubts about why I traveled to the Soviet T-34 76 medium tank during World War II, the dull and loud sound caused by this piercing shell was like a funeral bell from hell, completely awakening Lin Jie, who was still in a blank mind. This is a battlefield, either you die or I die. If you dare to harm me, then I will kill you first. Based on the supreme truth of whether you die or I die on the battlefield, Lin Jie, who had never felt so skilled in operating in a tank before, immediately reached out and pulled the headless body from the gunner's position to his own position in exchange. Lin Jie, who had passed through the lower part of the bolt and switched to the gunner's position, immediately bent down and picked up a 76mm full-caliber armor-piercing bullet from the chassis directly below his seat, and returned to the gunner's position stained with bloodstains. Temporarily placing the shell next to the nearby seat, he reached out and pulled open the bolt, causing a yellow-orange armor-piercing shell case to fall into the shell collection box at the tail of the gun, carrying the scorching heat from the barrel. Continuing to lift his hand and lift the 76mm full-caliber armor-piercing shell next to his seat, he lifted it again and pushed it into the barrel. After closing the bolt, he leaned his entire face forward to the gunner's shooting sight. Lin Jie then began to rotate the adjustment wheel in his hand to fine-tune the pitch angle of the main gun and the direction pointed by the barrel, and quickly aimed it at the target in his field of view that he had locked with his naked eye. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Brave Heart. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Brave Heart. As an excellent tank that overwhelmingly outnumbered the German armored forces in terms of equipment quality in the early stages of the Soviet-German War, the F-34 Type 41.2 caliber 76.2 mm tank gun equipped on the 1941 T34 76 medium tank in Lin Jie's hand undoubtedly outperformed the German tank's oncoming in terms of firepower and armor penetration value. Lin Jie, who was busy with the triple responsibility of being a gunner, vehicle commander, and loader and barely touching the ground, had no idea how he learned and proficiently mastered these professional armored skills by roughly adjusting the center point of the gun mirror's field of view by the distance from the shooting target. With all his heart set on surviving in this battle, Lin Jie, convinced that he had aimed his gun at the target, immediately instinctively lifted his foot and stepped on the firing pedal of the main gun. The BR-350B 76mm hooded armor-piercing grenade, which had already been pushed into the barrel, was immediately ignited by the gunpowder primer under the sudden impact of the firing pin inside the bolt. The BR-350B hooded armor-piercing grenade, with a muzzle velocity of 655 meters per second, rushed straight towards the German Type 4C tank pointed at by the muzzle like an arrow. Both within expectations and somewhat surprising. This German Type 4C tank, which was in a stationary state at a distance of over 500 meters due to parking and firing at Lin Jie's vehicle, had no time to dodge the sudden incoming shells and was unexpectedly hit by shells fired from Lin Jie's hand, accurately hitting the frontal armor on the front of the vehicle. The rolled steel armor on the front of the early Type 4C tank, which was only 30 mm thick, was unable to withstand attacks from the T34 76 medium tank. The BR-350B hood armor-piercing grenade, which could still penetrate 85 mm of vertical steel armor at a distance of 500 meters, was able to withstand the 30 mm armor defense of the Type 4C tank with ease. Since the start of the war, the Germans have always adhered to the vertical armor design to this day, but instead gave the T-34 76 tank more perfect firepower space. It's as easy as piercing a red razor into a cream cake. This 76mm full-caliber armor-piercing bullet from Lin Jie's hand left a fist-sized puncture hole in the upper armor of the front of tank number 4 and continued to move forward. The warhead's warhead charge, which contained an equivalent amount of 108 grams of TNT explosive equivalent, immediately detonated in the interior space of tank number 4 under the action of the armor-piercing delay fuse. Bang! Just like champagne that was opened directly by a bottle opener after violent shaking, the German No. 4 tank, which was detonated by the BR-350B hood armor-piercing grenade in the interior space of the vehicle, could not withstand such power. In an instant, this explosion equivalent to 100 grams of TNT detonated dozens of 75mm shells located on the chassis of the vehicle, causing a strong tank suicide. The explosion started and the flames soared into the sky. The entire group of 5 German tank members, who were in a state of combat inside tank number 4, were unable to react or escape due to a rush of time. The dead bodies could only be charred in the flames of shell explosions and gasoline burning inside the tank. Looking inside the gun mirror, Lin Jie saw the remains of the German No. 4 tank, which had been destroyed by a shell fired by himself and subsequently ignited into a raging fire. The body of the German tank, with its commander half hanging outside the turret and shrouded in flames, was so glaring and eye-catching. Everything I did in just 10 seconds took the lives of 5 people in one go, but if I didn't do it, the person who died would surely be myself. War never concerns who is right or wrong, it only concerns who can stand up with a smile and achieve ultimate victory. Through the observation windows in their respective positions, they witnessed the military achievements that Lin Jie had just achieved after being busy alone. The driver and mechanic, who were incredulous at the sight in front of them, immediately exclaimed in excitement inside the chassis of the vehicle. "Oh my goodness, Comrade Lieutenant, you hit him. Look at those German bastards, they're burning. Haha. The Great Red Army is invincible. Go home and eat shit, you spicy invaders." Listening to the cheers echoing in the narrow and enclosed body space of the T34 76 medium tank in his ear, Lin Jie, who was already sweating profusely under a series of busy movements and tense environmental stimuli, dared not show any signs of neglect and immediately issued orders to his 2 subordinates. "Xiaoliaosha, take us out of here and continue moving forward at 1 speed. Nikolai, come up and help me load the shells. We need to continue attacking these German devils, come on." "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant, I'm coming right now." After receiving Lin Jie's order, he struggled to leave the position of the mechanic located at the front of the vehicle chassis, and eventually crawled to the loading hand position inside the turret, hunched over and reaching out his hand to transfer the body of Captain Brasovsky, the former commander and gunner of the vehicle, to the vehicle chassis for temporary placement. This series of seemingly light and simple actions is extremely difficult for the already tall Slavic people. The T-34 tank sacrificed a considerable amount of interior space due to the use of large area tilted armor to enhance the overall defense of the vehicle, which was a bit too difficult for the mechatronic engineer Nikolai to complete Lin Jie's order. With sweat all over his head, he struggled to climb up to the position where Lin Jie should have taken over as the loader. He took out an armor-piercing shell from the chassis and held it in his arms. Immediately, under Lin Jie's command, Nikolai began to load the shell with that slightly unfamiliar action. At 2 o'clock, about 350 meters away, prepare for armor-piercing shells. 1 armor-piercing bullet, complete loading. With the help of the electric steering wheel of the turret, the adjustment wheel was vigorously hand-cranked, and the turret was rotated at the fastest speed through the gunner's wide-angle periscope, which provided a decent observation view, and the muzzle was aimed at the next target. Unconsciously, Lin Jie had already fully integrated into the combat mode and immediately shifted his perspective back to the view of the gun mirror located next to the bolt, starting the final pitch and direction adjustment of the gun barrel before firing. After a simple visual distance measurement and rough experience judgment, Lin Jie locked the target. Without any hesitation, he immediately stepped on the main gun firing pedal and fired another hooded armor-piercing grenade that was ready to be fired in the barrel. It was then fired at the target in a burst of firelight shaking at the muzzle. When another German No. 3 tank traveling with him was pierced through the turret armor by Lin Jie's artillery and immediately abandoned by 3 surviving members of the crew, a deafening shout from behind Lin Jie's car immediately spread to the ears of all members of the crew. For the Soviet mother, eliminate these fascist invaders. Dwerich, Ula. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Assault on Oreca. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4 Assault on Oreca accompanied by the high-spirited slogans coming from outside the car, the sound of galloping footsteps began to mix with passionate slogans of battle and the roar of tank engines echoing in Lin Jie's ears for a long time. Lin Jie, who first reacted slightly from shock and realized that the situation on the battlefield he was in might have changed dramatically, immediately lifted the top cover of the turret above his head and poked his entire upper body out of the car. Within the visible range, countless high-morale Red Army soldiers were gripping their Mosingan rifles and DP light machine guns, accompanied by early models of Soviet tanks such as the BT series fast tanks and T-26, launching a fierce attack on the German troops facing the enemy. Unlike various anti-Soviet rumors in later Western countries that went black for the sake of darkness, at this moment, within Lin Jie's field of vision, there were quite a few Soviet grassroots political commissioners holding a Tupolev 33 pistol in their hands, leading their respective Red Army soldiers to launch a counterattack against Nazi invaders. These young Soviet grassroots political commissioners may have serious dogmatism and various non-mainstream shortcomings, but the vast majority of these young officers who play a pivotal role in the political education and morale of the Red Army grassroots forces undoubtedly have the courage to match their positions and beliefs. Just like the last straw that completely crushed the half-dead camel, the German army, which had only a few tanks left and was suddenly attacked during the repair process, finally couldn't withstand the overwhelming attack of such a massive Soviet counterattack force. The remaining German tanks immediately shifted their gearbox to reverse gear after Kankin stopped moving forward, and then began to retreat towards the rear, carrying the already chaotic German infantry behind them. The principle of taking advantage of your illness to kill you is not only a wise saying in China, but also for the Soviet army, which is currently at a great time to seize the opportunity to defeat the invaders. Stop and stop. Hold the starting position, we can't let those Soviets break through our defense line, quickly repel them. The starting point mentioned by the German commander was a small Soviet village near Oreca, where a part of the 13th Armored Division of the German Armed Forces, which had previously been occupied, was stationed and temporarily repaired. After a brutal attack earlier, the assault squad belonging to the German 13th Armored Division was caught off guard by the vanguard of the Soviet 20th Tank Division, which launched a counterattack at dawn. Despite the subsequent reaction, the German commander in the village immediately commanded armored units and accompanying infantry to launch an armored counterattack against the Soviet army, and achieved good results in destroying more than 10 T-26, BT-5, and BT-7 light tanks of the Soviet vanguard. But only the T-34 tank, which looked like a command vehicle for Soviet offensive forces, stood firm like a rock in the sea under the impact of various anti-tank weapons from the German army. Whether it is the most advanced Type 4C tank equipped with a 75mm short-barrel gun in the current German armor sequence, or the anti-armor weapon PAK-36 37mm infantry anti-tank gun that the German army has relied on in previous blitzkrieg attacks. These artifacts, which had always been disadvantageous in the early German blitzkrieg attacks on Europe, almost all turned into scrap like knocking bricks after encountering the twisted tilted armor defense of the Soviet T-34 medium tank. Worse situations followed one after another. Just as the German army deployed various anti-armor weapons and used dozens of armor-piercing shells to repeatedly concentrate their attacks, it seemed that they finally caused some internal damage to the headache-inducing T-34 medium tank, causing it to stop charging. The German commander, who had not yet been filled with joy, led the remaining armored units under his command to charge forward and completely destroy and even capture this incredibly powerful enemy tank. This Soviet T-34 tank, which was originally seen by the German army as completely cold after being pierced through armor, turned its terrifying turret again like it had been resurrected from the ground with blood, aiming its black gun caliber directly at the attacking German troops. Seeing that this new Soviet tank, which was about to be fully captured by our own side, rejoined the attack and engaged in battle with the arrival of subsequent Soviet reinforcements, the unwilling German commander, in order to avoid being flanked by Soviet BT series light tanks with extremely fast mobility, had to command the remaining troops to retreat like a tide to the starting position in the village and enter a defensive posture. Standing outside the turret with his upper body, Lin Jie watched as friendly tanks and infantry roared past him, launching a fierce attack on the gradually retreating German troops in the village with an absolute advantage. Feeling relieved that he had finally been saved, Lin Jie was also very clear about what he should do at this moment. Lin Jie, who had peeked out of the turret to observe the surrounding situation, retracted his upper body back into the turret and closed the integrated heavy hatch unique to the early T-34 tank. Without hesitation in his words, Lin Jie immediately gave orders to the driver's name in his impression. Xiaoliaosha, let's go. Let's go and completely tear up those spicy and crispy fahis. Yes. Comrade Lieutenant. The 4-stroke V-shaped 12-cylinder water-cooled diesel engine equipped in the rear engine compartment of the T-34 tank surged again with the swift operation of driver Xiaoliaosha. The powerful diesel engine with a rated maximum output power of 500 horsepower immediately drove the T-34 76 medium tank, which weighed just over 28 tons in combat, towards the German defense line in the village at an off-road speed of over 30 km per hour. The bright green 7.92 mm drag light machine gun barrage, accompanied by 75 mm armor-piercing bullets, poured out the maximum amount of firepower as the Soviet infantry and tank coordinated forces roared towards them. The brutal and intense white heat battle made it impossible for the German troops who had just retreated from their starting positions in the village to reorganize their defense lines in the face of the rapid Soviet infiltration attack. One point in the middle, the Soviets are coming up. Fire, fire. Ammunition, I'm out of ammunition. I need a secondary shooter, where is the secondary shooter? Left, right. Towards 12 o'clock, the Soviets are everywhere. Tanks, quickly repel their tanks. Damn it, these 37 knocking bricks have no effect on Ivan's tank. Who invented this kind of junk? Although the defense forces of the German 13th Armored Division, which guarded the village houses and infantry trenches, were idle in their overall strategic posture, the Soviet counterattack forces, which launched attacks with absolute superiority and high morale, were no less impressive. The German MG-34 machine gun team, which continuously fired and strafed, was eventually crushed into a pile of iron plates and meat pieces by the rolling Soviet BT-7 fast tank platoon with guns. The German army, who were trapped in the village and fighting to the death, only had a few No. 3 and No. 4 tanks left. Finally, under the name of Lin Jie's leading T-34 tank, they became piles of burning steel crematoriums. That evening, the Soviet 9th Mechanized Army, led by Major General Rokossovsky, finally achieved its predetermined combat objectives after a day of fighting. The 9th Mechanized Army, with the absolute advantage of the main force of the 35th Tank Division and the vanguard of the 20th Tank Division, dealt a heavy blow to the German Defense Forces' elite 13th Armored Division located in the southwest corner of the Kleven area and near Oreca, achieving the Soviet Union's first tactical victory since Germany launched the Barbarossa invasion. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. The Arrival of Political Commissars. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. The Arrival of Political Commissars. The peaceful and desolate moonlight has enveloped the land that has gradually cooled down from the war. In this small village where the fierce conflict between the Soviet and German armies erupted a few hours ago, Lin Jie, who had been fighting all day in a daze for unknown reasons, is sitting next to his parked T-34 tank, fiddling with the food in his lunchbox. A little bit of peas mixed with something similar to vegetable sauce dripped sticky in the spoon. Although this kind of food seemed a bit difficult to describe as delicious in Lin Jie's own eyes, the fatigue and empty stomach feeling of driving the tank all day in the war still made it difficult for him to resist the hot and steaming food, which began to bloom in large chunks. Before Lin Jie, who was starving, could finish all the liquid food in the lunch box in front of him. The figure running along the way followed closely and came to Lin Jie, who was only focused on eating and unaware. Who is the commander of Tank 177? There is an important mission assignment. Upon hearing the sudden words ringing in his ear, Lin Jie immediately lifted his head and followed the sound. However, the identity of the person who arrived also stunned the driver Xiaoliaosha and the mechanic Nicole, who were busy filling their stomachs next to the tank. Dingling, The sound of metal lunchboxes and cutlery colliding and even falling to the ground suddenly rang out in the open space next to the tank. In a flustered and somewhat bewildered state, Xiaoliaosha and Nikolai quickly stood up from the ground, sitting cross-legged in a rolling and crawling posture. Political Commissar Petrov, good evening. Comrade Political Commissar, Nikolai, the mechanical and electrical engineer of Car 177, reports to you. Wishing you good health. Looking at the panicked and bewildered two people in front of them, they furrowed their brows. This seemingly ordinary scene at this moment made Colonel Petrov, the division-level political commissar of the 20th Tank Division, very angry. You two little fools. I'll ask you again, where is your driver? Tell him to come out and see you. Comrade Political Commissar, there's no need to look, I am. After putting down the little food left in his lunchbox, he stood up straight from the tank, and a sudden young voice interrupted Colonel Petrov's unfinished words. After slightly adjusting his standing posture, Lin Jie straightened up and saluted Colonel Petrov, then spoke up in a serious tone. Captain Brasovsky, the original commander and gunner of vehicle number 177, sacrificed his life, and Lieutenant Malashenko, the loader, served as the temporary commander to command the battle. Please instruct, Comrade Political Commissar. Looking at the young man in front of him with a resolute and meticulous expression, who was standing at attention and bowing to him, Colonel Petrov, who seemed to have believed the rumors, nodded slowly at Lin Jie in an instant. Very good, Lieutenant Malashenko. I came here to ask you a few questions. Your former commander, Captain Brasovsky, died in battle for what reason? Sure enough, the one who should have come has arrived. While sighing inwardly, Lin Jie pretended to be calm. Knowing that as a lower-level officer in the Soviet Army in 1941, he had to be extremely cautious in responding to all inquiries from senior political commissioners to avoid causing trouble, Lin Jie, who appeared calm on the surface, immediately reached out to his car and made an invitation gesture to Colonel Petrov. Comrade Political Commissar, there are some issues that I cannot articulate clearly. Please follow me. Despite harboring doubts about Lin Jie's words, he eventually followed his footsteps to the front of the T-34 tank. What appeared in front of Colonel Petrov was the heavily damaged armor of the T-34 tank, which was reflected in the pale moonlight. In the brutal and intense battle that lasted for a day during the day, although the front armor of Lin Jie's T-34 tank and the vast majority of the turret front armor withstood attacks from 10 types of armor-piercing shells ranging in caliber from 37 mm to 75 mm by German soldiers, these armor-piercing shells, which were scattered by tilted armor, still left shallow and dense, like lunar craters, on the surface of the T-34 tank's armor. After seeing this scene, before Lin Jie could speak, Colonel Petrov, who seemed to be able to see the cruel and intense battle of the day again, couldn't help but nod slowly at the T-34 tank in front of him, which was covered in scars. It seems that you and your crew have experienced a very difficult battle during the day today, Lieutenant Malashenko. Your loyalty and courage are commendable. I will definitely report this situation to Colonel Cherniev later. Colonel Cherniev, as mentioned by Political Commissar Petrov, is actually the acting commander of the 20th Tank Division. Earlier, when Major General Rokossovsky received orders to lead the 9th Mechanized Army to attack the German army, Kadykov, the commander of the 20th Tank Division of the main force under the 9th Mechanized Army, was hospitalized due to illness and unable to take his place. His deputy commander, Colonel Cherniev, took over the command temporarily and followed the 9th Mechanized Army's troops to set off. So, based on the current situation, the 20th Tank Division where Lin Jie is located is actually temporarily replaced by Colonel Cherniev as the division commander. Thank you, Comrade Political Commissar, but I have more important information to explain to you. Lin Jie, who was eager to explain the true situation to the Political Commissar, didn't pay much attention to the honors and awards he had and didn't have. He then shifted his focus back to the main topic. Please take a look here, Comrade Political Commissar. At that time, Captain Brasovsky was sitting in the gunner's position on the right inside the turret, but unfortunately, this position was initially estimated to have been repeatedly fired by at least 20 German armor-piercing shells, and eventually experienced very severe armor fatigue. After that, the armor on the right side of the turret, which was once again subjected to a strong external force from an incoming armor-piercing shell, finally couldn't withstand the strong kinetic energy impact and burst from the inside. Scattered armor fragments splattered in the narrow interior space of the turret, with one of them piercing Comrade Brasovsky's neck and ultimately causing his sacrifice. However, I managed to escape the disaster by being located near the left loader inside the turret. Following the position pointed by Lin Jie's right hand, he indeed saw the obvious cracked armor gap in the area near the gun shield on the right side of the T-34 tank turret. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, who was familiar with the general situation of his own T-34 tank, had already silently recognized Lin Jie's statement in his heart. In order to simplify manufacturing processes, reduce production costs, and shorten the manufacturing time of individual tanks, the Soviet Union boldly used integral cast turrets on T-34 tanks instead of the German sharp-edged welded cut armor. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. T34 Misery. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6 T34 Misery. Compared to the cutting and welding armor used by German tanks, the advantages of the integral cast turret used by T-34 tanks are obvious. The one-time-formed integral casting turret not only significantly reduces the manufacturing process of tank turrets, but also shortens the working hours required for turret manufacturing. At the same time, it also avoids the waste of scraps caused by cutting and welding armor, as well as the tedious furnace melting process. In terms of production cost, it reduces the price required to manufacture a turret to the lowest level, laying a solid foundation for the subsequent large-scale production of T-34 tanks and steel flood tactics. However, at the same time, due to the unavoidable technological backwardness of the Soviet tank army industry compared to the German tank army industry, as well as the inherent attribute defects brought about by the integral cast turret itself. The internal armor of the T-34 tank turret is often affected by impurities, dust, and a large amount of bubbles mixed in during the production process of the integral cast turret, ultimately affecting the overall armor quality of the formed turret. Generally speaking, in the early stages of the Soviet-German War, this weakness was not yet evident when faced with the almost powerless armor-piercing ability of the German short-barreled tank guns and the armor-piercing shells fired by the 37 knocking bricks. But once encountering another German anti-tank artifact, the Flak 36/37 88mm anti-aircraft gun, its PZGR hooded armor-piercing shell has the terrifying power to penetrate 125mm vertical armor at a distance of 500 meters. And this, for the T-34 76 mid-tank 1941 model, the only 90mm armor thickness of the gun shield and the 45mm thick turret on both sides of the cheeks on the front were simply deadly. The T-34 tank's cast turret armor, which was originally filled with many impurities and bubbles inside the armor, immediately exposed its fatal weakness of insufficient armor quality when facing the German 88th gun, which had a penetration depth far beyond its defensive capabilities. The poor quality of turret armor often leads to the unquestionable direct penetration of the German 88mm anti-aircraft gun. Compared to the theoretical armor defense thickness on paper, the overall cast turret is almost unable to withstand any attack from the German 88mm gun. Although during today's daytime battle, German troops who encountered a Soviet surprise attack during the repair process and hastily responded did not deploy their anti-tank artifact 88 guns. However, during the battle, due to its unique and powerful appearance, which was significantly larger than the surrounding friendly BT series fast tanks and T-26 light tanks, tank number 177 T-34 was naturally given priority by the German anti-tank firepower. The turret of tank T-34-177, which was hit by various German armor-piercing shells, had the highest probability of being hit. After multiple rounds of repeated firing, the right frontal armor of the turret finally suffered severe armor fatigue and debris collapse due to the hidden dangers buried by the cast turret. And ultimately, it resulted in the death of Captain Brasovsky, the former commander of the vehicle, due to the splashing of armor fragments from the collapse of his own vehicle, which was the scene that Lin Jie witnessed with his own eyes when he first crossed the battlefield. Colonel Petrov, as the political commissar of the 20th Tank Division, naturally knows the hidden danger of insufficient armor quality caused by the overall cast turret of his own T34 tank. But a small lieutenant colonel naturally has no ability to change the situation of insufficient armor quality. The strategic policy of simplifying manufacturing processes, reducing production costs, and shortening the manufacturing hours of individual tanks was ultimately used to form a steel flood and crush the enemy with an absolute advantage in the number of armored units, which was approved by the great leader Comrade Stalin as the Soviet Army's established armor strategy. As a grassroots commander and political commissar of the Soviet Red Army, Colonel Petrov's job was to better fight this patriotic war and serve the country under existing conditions, mobilizing the morale of his troops and stabilizing their morale. As for those strategic issues, they are not something that a small lieutenant colonel can and should consider. However, despite this, Colonel Petrov, who felt the heavy responsibility on his shoulders and the need to help Lin Jie win the honor corresponding to his achievements, eventually reached out and slowly patted Lin Jie's shoulder, responding with slightly warm words. "Tell me, Comrade Malashenko. How many enemies did you and your boys eliminate in today's daytime battle?" Lin Jie was taken aback by the tone of this political commissar, which seemed to turn 180 degrees in an instant. Despite some confusion, he ultimately gave the slightly conservative and uncertain answer through memories in his mind. There are approximately 9 enemy tanks and at least 7 anti-tank guns, most of which are German Type 3 tanks and 38 T light tanks. There are 2 Type 4 tanks, or possibly 3. The anti-tank guns are all small, 37 knock-on bricks, but fortunately, the Germans in the village do not carry their 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The bulky ones are indeed not suitable for rapid field propulsion. "Well, that's great." After listening to Lin Jie's answer, he immediately showed an appreciative expression and nodded slowly again to show approval. After a brief pause, Colonel Petrov spoke up again to ask questions. "Can there be accompanying friendly units to prove your achievements, Comrade Malashenko? You should know that if you declare so many achievements, it will inevitably raise doubts among some jealous people. For your own sake and also for the honor of our division, it is best to have accompanying friendly units witness and testify about these achievements." Everything is as Colonel Petrov said in his words. Up to now, in the Barbarossa invasion launched by the German army, the hasty response of the Soviet Western Army Group has been extremely defeated. In this context, declaring such a remarkable victory report clearly requires the testimony of some eyewitnesses to block the jealousy and suspicion of some people. Having already guessed that Colonel Petrov would ask such a question, Lin Jie, who was already prepared with a corresponding answer in his heart, immediately spoke up. "Yes, Comrade Political Commissar. During the subsequent actions of our division's vanguard troops arriving and launching a counterattack, Tank 311 BT-7 and Tank 202 T-26 accompanied my vehicle's left and right coordinated attacks, and they could prove my words." Upon hearing this, Colonel Petrov, who had no worries in his heart, was completely relieved. At present, the Soviet army, which was suffering losses and retreating step by step, needed heroes like Lieutenant Malashenko the most. Once his genuine military achievements are appropriately packaged and embellished and publicized within the entire Red Army, the heroic role and leading role he can play will be immeasurable, and this is also one of the necessary responsibilities of Colonel Petrov as a division-level political commissar. Thinking of this, Colonel Petrov, who felt it necessary to discuss this matter with the acting division commander Colonel Cherniev and report the results, immediately spoke again to Lin Jie. "Comrade Malashenko, if possible, I think you should come with me to the division headquarters. Comrade Cherniev will definitely be very eager to meet our division's combat heroes." End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Division Headquarters Tour. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7 Division Headquarters Tour. Although he was somewhat surprised by the demands made by Colonel Petrov, upon closer examination, he felt that he should not and had no qualifications to refuse the proposal from the division-level political commissar. Lin Jie then smiled and nodded slowly at Colonel Petrov. "I am extremely happy, this is my honor, comrade political commissar." Following Colonel Petrov's footsteps, he began walking towards the headquarters of the Soviet 20th Tank Division, which was also in the same village. Along the way, Lin Jie, who was still curious about this unfamiliar world of war, saw many Red Army soldiers sitting together in groups of 3 or 2, eating and resting. These young warriors, who are about the same age as Lin Jie, do not have the high morale and fearless determination advertised in literary works on their faces. The trauma of war and the shadow of death are like shadows that accompany each numb and lifeless face, as if their souls have evaporated. As the fierce and fearless courage that erupted from the depths of the heart gradually faded with the lingering warmth of the battlefield, leaving only the longing for distant loved ones and the fear of war and death for every soul. After taking a panoramic view of the various battlefield scenes along the way, I finally followed Colonel Petrov's footsteps and arrived at the headquarters of the 20th Tank Division located in the center of the village. Several seemingly rudimentary wooden poles were erected around the field tent, supporting radio antennas and being guarded by a group of energetic Red Army soldiers. A Soviet division-level field command headquarters, which was most ordinary and common in the summer of 1941, appeared in front of Lin Jie. Unlike the Red Army soldiers who hold the classic Barbarossa 41 submachine gun in their impression. In the summer of 1941, when the German army had just launched the Barbarossa invasion, the Barbarossa 41 submachine gun was still a prototype that had just been replicated and finalized based on the Finnish Suomi submachine gun prototype. Only dozens of experimental weapons were tested to test weapon performance and improve shortcomings. So at this moment, the weapons held by these Red Army soldiers responsible for guarding the headquarters of the 20th Tank Division are only the old Mosin 1891/30 bolt-action rifles. In addition, sharp-eyed Lin Jie even saw several burly Red Army soldiers holding DP light machine guns in their hands and standing guard, seemingly in a very furry bear-style posture. Before Lin Jie, who looked like a curious baby, could finish admiring all the scenery outside the division headquarters, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov turned around and spoke to Lin Jie. "Comrade Malyshenko, I will go in and inform Director Cherniev. Please wait for me here for a moment." After speaking, Lin Jie, who had not yet fully recovered from his wandering soul, spoke up and responded. Colonel Petrov, who had always been accustomed to focusing on efficiency and racing against time, strode forward without hesitation and lifted the curtain of the headquarters field tent. "Damn it, spicy lackey. Speak up. Where are your division's main troops and headquarters, and what is the next operational intention of your entire army group?" As the saying goes, one must hear the sound before seeing anyone. Before Colonel Petrov, who had just lifted the tent curtain, saw Colonel Cherniev himself, the familiar and terrible Slavic man's screams and curses first reached his ears. In a corner of the tent, Cherniev, the acting commander of the 20th Tank Division, dressed in the uniform of a Soviet colonel, yelled loudly at a German officer in front of him who was trapped in a seat with a swollen nose and face. The sticky liquid mixed with runny nose, tears, and blood had already stained the iron-gray uniform of this German lieutenant colonel into a mess. His whole body was covered in dirty stains, and the German lieutenant colonel, who was covered in unknown bloodstains, had been beaten by Cherniev and 2 Soviet soldiers around him, making his nose and face swollen and disheveled. Even with 2 teeth knocked out, the poor German lieutenant colonel continued to mutter those ambiguous words that had been repeated countless times. "I have said it many times, and if I really know more intelligence and news, I will definitely tell you. Our division's main troops and headquarters have been on the move, and radio communication has been cut off for several hours. How could I possibly know where the headquarters is now?" The muttering of blood bubbles from his throat made the words particularly harsh and unpleasant. The German Defense Force lieutenant colonel, who was injured and captured in battle and then subjected to severe torture by the Soviet army, almost found it difficult to even speak. The task of the Southern Group Army under our division is to continue advancing towards the hinterland of your Soviet Union. The primary goal of the first phase is to encircle and capture Kiev. These are all the contents I heard from our division's combat meeting, and no matter how much I, as a small lieutenant colonel, can know. For the sake of my truthful explanation, I beg you to stop and let me go quickly. After hearing the German lieutenant colonel's honest confession once again, he finally temporarily put down the thick and short wooden stick he had been holding tightly in his hand. Colonel Cherniv, who had been busy shouting and beating for a long time, then reached out and pulled a chair, sitting down heavily as if taking a breath. Comrade Division Commander, personally interrogating a prisoner of war in this way is not like the style that senior Red Army officers should have. It is important to note that the body is the capital of revolution. If you are exhausted, who else can we expect to lead our division to victory? Upon hearing this low voice coming from behind, Cherniv couldn't help but be slightly taken aback. Suddenly, he turned his head and followed closely behind to see the familiar figure standing not far behind him. "Oh, Petrov, you idiot! How many times have I told you, before you come in, remember to shout at least to let me know you're here, and every time you end up floating around like a ghost." Upon hearing Cherniv's words, he immediately gave a faint smile, and then Petrov, the political commissar who stepped forward with his legs wide, looked very indifferent to it. The so-called ghosts and the fabricated products of the little bourgeois do not exist at all. The great communist warriors will not be superstitious about these products created by idealistic ideas. Tell me, my dear comrade Niaev, what have you extracted from this stubborn and crunchy person's mouth during the time I left? Reluctantly waving his hand at Colonel Petrov's question, Cherniv, who had hardly obtained any more intelligence, seemed very disappointed about it. Still the same old trick. This spicy and crunchy lackey's mouth can't spit out even a little bit of anything else except for a few questions and the fact that he doesn't know the main attack direction of the southern cluster is Kiev. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Night Gunshots. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8 Night Gunshots. After hearing the complaint from Cherniv, Colonel Petrov, who had already anticipated such a result, immediately smiled at each other. Take a look, what I said earlier, Comrade Commander. I've told you before that it's not realistic to pry out something valuable from a small, crispy defense lieutenant colonel's mouth. With his identity, it's difficult to even know how much logistic supplies their division has per month, let alone other more valuable intelligence. After removing the large-brimmed political commissar hat from his head, he reached out his fingers and gently brushed the emblem symbolizing faith and glory on the hat, as if caressing the face of his lover. Colonel Petrov, who spoke slowly and calmly, appeared confident in his analysis of his righteousness. Am I right? A spicy and crunchy running dog. For a moment, his swollen face, filled with surprise and fear, turned towards Colonel Petrov, who had a calm expression on his face. After a moment of pause, his gaze continued to look at Commander Cherniv, who had a gloomy expression on his side. The German lieutenant colonel, who had been beaten up, nodded slowly in hesitation. You see, Comrade Commander, even he admitted it himself. Now this spicy and lackey member is not of much use to us. I think it's time to send him to where he should go. With a face as heavy as water, I glanced at Petrov with a corner of my eye, who seemed to be helpless, and then turned to glance at the German lieutenant who was less than a step away from me and had already been beaten to death. With a light sigh, Cherniv didn't seem to think of a better way to deal with it for a moment. In the end, he had to wave his right arm gently towards the tent door after reluctantly waving his hand. That's it then, take him away and move quickly. Petrov, who had been working with Cherniv for a long time, naturally understood the profound meaning contained in the words and actions of the acting commander, and immediately gave a glance to the two heavily armed Red Army soldiers in the tent. Did you hear everyone? Take him to where he should go. Yes, Comrade Political Commissar. After hearing this, he immediately shook his hands and threw his Moschenigan rifles behind his back. His sturdy arms, as thick and thin as a little girl's thighs, immediately pressed against the German lieutenant who had been beaten to death and almost had difficulty walking towards the tent door. Seeing himself finally able to escape from this torture, the German major felt a temporary sense of relief for his fate of being taken as a prisoner of war. "Thank you." Although the German voice was so soft with a murmur of blood bubbles and a hint of blood that even the two Red Army soldiers responsible for escorting him could not hear clearly, a subtle and eerie smile gradually appeared on the face of the political commissar Petrov standing in place, caressing his hat emblem and passing by the German major. As the German lieutenant colonel was escorted out of the tent, Petrov, with a natural expression on his face, strode forward to Cherniv, who was sitting in a chair, lost in thought. Bang! A gunshot piercing through the night sky suddenly rang out in the peaceful village. The Red Army soldiers, who were repairing in various corners of the village, were startled by the familiar sound of the Moschenigan rifle. They quickly grabbed their weapons and looked towards the direction of the village Central Division headquarters where the gunshot was ringing. The Red Army veterans, who were dozing off against the wall, were indifferent. "Let's all take a break, new recruits. The division headquarters has a German major on trial today. Don't let your limbs dominate your brains in reverse." Watching the German lieutenant who stumbled and fell forward in the field due to being shot in the back of the head, Lin Jie, who had witnessed the scene with his own eyes, was shocked to see that the 7.62 by 54 mm full-power rifle bullet from the Moschenigan had instantly lifted half of his head. "Listen to this touching and beautiful voice, my dear comrade Cherniv. The sound of the righteous Red Army gunfire ending the lives of the lackeys is simply the most beautiful heavenly sound. Even if I listen to it continuously for a whole night, I won't tire of it." Cherniv, who was pondering important matters in his heart, turned the focus of the topic to the main matter, as he remained noncommittal to Petrov's deep admiration that resembled that of a minstrel poet. "Speaking of which, Peter. How's the situation with you going down to investigate that matter? Is the record of Car 177 really true?" Upon hearing Cherniv's inquiry, he put aside his deep sigh and responded with a positive expression on Petrov's face, then slowly spoke up. "That's right, comrade commander. The rumor that Car 177 destroyed more than a dozen German tanks during the day today is indeed true, and I have already visited and investigated many of our Red Army soldiers. However, Captain Brasovsky, the commander and gunner of Car 177, sacrificed himself in his position shortly after the battle began. It was Lieutenant Malyshenko, the loader, who led Car 177 to achieve such results." "What? Captain Brasovsky sacrificed, and it was the loader Malyshenko who led the fleet to create this record alone. What's going on?" Although he was both struck by thunder and deeply surprised when he first heard this news, Cherniv, who gradually calmed down by Petrov's affirmative expression and plain expression, also began to realize the importance of this matter. "Okay, since you personally investigated it, I think I have reason to believe the authenticity of this matter. Our Red Army soldiers have a firm belief and the courage to fight invincible as support, and it is indeed possible with our high-performance tanks." Reaching out his hand to gently caress his chin and carefully pondering, Cherniv, who was considering the matter as a superior and coincided with Petrov's thoughts, immediately continued to speak. "This matter is extraordinary, Peter. A steadfast Red Army soldier led only 2 remaining members of the fleet to achieve such a significant victory in just one day. It must be said to be a miraculous great victory. I think we should list the details of this matter in a book and report it to General Rokossovsky. This is the most outstanding honor our 20th Tank Division has achieved since the start of the war." After turning the brim of his hat in his hand and putting it back on his head, Petrov, with a smile on his face, immediately smiled slowly at Cherniv in front of him. "I had already guessed that you would make the same decision as me, so I specially brought our hero along this time. How about that? Do you want to personally inquire about his combat details?" End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Ambiguous Future. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Chapter 9. Ambiguous future. In the tent of the Field Division headquarters of the 20th Tank Division, after consulting with Lin Jie for a long time, Commander Cherniv finally cleared all the remaining doubts in his heart. So, were you alone in the battle, holding the triple positions of commander, gunner, and loader, leading the surviving mechanics and drivers of your fleet to win this battle? Faced with the questioning from the acting teacher, Lin Jie, who was not afraid of shadows, immediately straightened his back. Yes, comrade commander. After Captain Brasovsky's sacrifice, I took over his position and continued the battle. Those German thin-skinned tanks were not worth mentioning in front of our T34 tanks. The wills of these crispy individuals were as fragile as their tanks, and the iron fists of the Red Army tanks would teach them what true armored warfare is. After hearing Lin Jie's impassioned speech, even Red Army division-level commanders like Cherniv couldn't help but glance at Colonel Petrov with a faint smile. Lieutenant Malashenko, if all grassroots Red Army officers and soldiers could have your revolutionary optimism and tenacious fighting spirit, then I think even crossing the Dnieper River would be just a fantasy on paper. After hearing General Cherniv's spirited and impassioned speech, Lin Jie, who squirmed his lips, finally raised his hand and saluted the commander in front of him. Comrade Commander, I firmly believe that our invincible Red Army will surely win the ultimate victory under the leadership of the great leader Comrade Stalin, and completely drive out these damn and ruthless invaders and their servants and lackeys from our motherland. I have no doubt about this and am always ready to dedicate myself to fighting to defend our motherland. Although he said so, as a future traveler, Lin Jie was familiar with the direction of the entire 1941 Soviet-German war in his heart. In no time, the German vanguard armored unit led by legendary German General Guderian will completely defeat the Soviet troops in front of them with a swift and fierce blitzkrieg attack, and quickly cross the Dnieper River to open up an attack route for the subsequent German army. At that time, the German Central Army Group led by Marshal Bock will gradually arrive and cross the Dnieper River, and then approach the heart of the Soviet capital Moscow. Throughout 1941, the Soviet army, which was at a huge strategic disadvantage, would have no more natural defenses on the road from the German Central Army Group to Moscow. Waiting for the Soviet Red Army would be an arduous battle surrounding the defense of the capital Moscow. Thinking of the cruel fact that the entire Soviet Red Army suffered losses of millions of troops in 1941, it was impossible to confront Lin Jie, who was said by the two immediate leaders in front of him that the German army would soon cross the Dnieper River and prepare to directly attack Moscow. He couldn't help but feel a cold sweat about his own fate. Damn it, we must find a way to withstand 1941. At the very least, we can't just let my 100 pounds be inexplicably confessed to this damn place. Just as Lin Jie was silently pondering how to get through the most difficult year of 1941, he was undoubtedly optimistic about the entire war to defend his homeland, and did not realize that Cherniv, who had never seen before the German Third Route Army Group's offensive, spoke up to Lin Jie, who was still pondering for a moment. Okay, Comrade Malashenko. I now officially announce and inform you that your rank will be promoted to captain from now on, and you will take over the position of captain of the 1st Tank Company from Captain Brasovsky, who sacrificed his life. In addition, I and Political Commissar Petrov attach great importance to your achievements. After a little sorting, we will send your battle report to our 9th Army Command. If nothing unexpected happens, I believe General Rokossovsky will be very happy after reading your battle report. Perhaps you can also receive a military medal that matches it. This is your honor, Comrade Malashenko. After listening to Master Cherniv's warm words, Lin Jie, who knew what to say, also smiled knowingly. No, Comrade Commander. To be precise, this is a common honor that belongs to our entire 20th Tank Division. After leaving the field tent of the division headquarters, it was already late at night. Looking up at the brilliant night sky above the grassland, Lin Jie let out a long sigh and began to walk back in the direction he had come. Undoubtedly, Everything that has happened since his sudden awakening has silently proven that Lin Jie is truly and truly on the Soviet-German battlefield in 1941. This year, the German army was unstoppable, advancing towards Moscow after surrounding Leningrad and capturing several Soviet strongholds such as Kiev. If it weren't for Stalin's wise eye and pearl recognition, coupled with Zhukov's proper command, to turn the tide, it would probably be the spicy and crisp black and red flag flying on the top of the Kremlin in 1942. As soon as Lin Jie thought of these, he couldn't help feeling another headache in his head. Damn it, there are 600,000 Red Army soldiers who surrendered and were captured by the German army in the Battle of Kiev alone, and as many as 1 million Red Army soldiers died in 1941. How old is my life to not be buried as a small captain in this dusty year of history? Lin Jie, who had become increasingly frustrated and restless all the way, quickly climbed up the turret and opened the top cover before jumping straight in front of his tank, T34 Tank No. 177, Xiaoliaosha and Nicole, who were secretly sharing a small bottle of private vodka in a corner by the side of the car, couldn't help but be taken aback when they saw this scene. They had no idea what was wrong with their superiors. Look at me, I look at you, but none of them dared to step forward and ask a good question. Relying on the gunner's seat inside the turret, which was still mixed with diesel and a hint of blood, Lin Jie felt quite tired and relieved his nerves. With the help of the cold moonlight shining from outside the top cover of the turret, he accidentally saw a black and white photo less than the size of a palm pasted on the bulkhead where he had originally filled his hand. With curiosity, Lin Jie reached out and gently removed this photo from the cabin wall. With the help of the moonlight in front of him, he quickly saw the content of the worn black and white photo. A beautiful young girl, and one more. Is this like I'm doing it myself? Although the theoretical concept of first meeting did make Lin Jie feel unfamiliar, another memory that truly existed in his mind silently told him that the true identity of the person in front of the photo was his own in this world. Dmitry Drakovich Malashenko. End of this chapter. Who am I in Chapter 10? You are listening at novelfull.audio. Who am I in Chapter 10? Dmitry Drakovich Marashenko, this is the name that Lin Jie is now well known and recognized by people around him. On July 31, 1916, a baby boy with this name was born in a small village on the outskirts of Moscow. He was a typical Russian peasant family who had been farming for generations. At the age of 19, Malashenko volunteered to join the Soviet Red Army and was admitted to the Ulyanovsk Tank Academy in 1935 of the same year. There, the young Malashenko learned for the first time how to control a tank and how to master a tank gun, making it more precise. In this regard, the young Malashenko is undoubtedly filled with hope and a beautiful longing for the turbulent years ahead. After studying for several years at the Ulyanovsk Tank Soldier School and graduating, the ambitious Malashenko soon caught up with the Soviet military operation against Poland in 1939 as a second lieutenant officer, truly experiencing the first real battle of his life with blood and fire. During this brief military operation, Malashenko, who commanded his T-26 light tank fleet to advance with great fanfare, met for the first time in curiosity with the same socialist brothers of the spicy German army. Looking at the scene where his unit commander and the German generals were chatting happily and even jokingly calling each other brothers, Marashenko, who was unable to even express his opinions due to his identity, unconsciously felt that something was wrong there. Today, the joint attack of two socialist brothers divided Poland. In the future, two armies that used to be sworn brothers can turn against each other to compete for survival space and fundamentally irreconcilable ideological contradictions. In the battle that led to the sacrifice of Captain Brasovsky, the former commander of Tank No. 177 T-34, Lieutenant Marashenko, who was then the deputy platoon commander, had to leave his command of Tank No. 177 at the most critical moment before the battle began due to mechanical failure. Instead, he temporarily joined Captain Brasovsky's command of Tank No. 177 T-34 as a loader. What happened later was everything that Lin Jie saw after waking up. With the profound skills accumulated by Lieutenant Malashenko in his early years at the Ulyanovsk Tank Soldier School, as well as the war experience accumulated during the previous invasion of Poland, Lin Jie, whose life was seriously threatened by German tanks, ultimately used Lieutenant Marashenko's body to unleash astonishing combat skills and effectiveness, shouldering the triple responsibility of commander, gunner, and loader on his own. With the overwhelming quality advantage of the T-34 tank, he killed the German No. 3 and No. 4 tanks on the opposite side without leaving a trace, and won the No. 1 kill of the 20th Tank Division in this battle. But even so, Lin Jie, who was sitting in the turret, couldn't help but feel doubtful after sorting out his thoughts. My identity is confirmed, and who is the young and beautiful girl in the photo that I am holding in my arms? Holding on to the back of his head, he pondered for nearly a minute amidst doubts, searching for the memory inherited from Lieutenant Marashenko in his mind, and finally realized it. Natalia Pokolonskaya, the daughter of a former Russian nobleman, was spared due to her young age when the Soviet came to power and was exiled to my village for adoption. She was a good friend and childhood sweetheart who grew up with her. Thinking of this, Malashenko, who had been silent for a while, couldn't help feeling a bit speechless. It's not certain whether one's life can be guaranteed or not, and it's all nonsense to deal with all these things. After a heartfelt sigh, Marashenko prepared to stick the photo back to the original position of the tank bulkhead, but he felt a bit uncomfortable halfway through. I have almost nothing on my body except for this photo, so it seems inappropriate to just place it in a position that is prone to wear and tear. After a brief internal struggle, with a light sigh, Malashenko ultimately chose to follow the guidance of his true inner will. After placing this old black and white photo of two people holding arms as a memento on the inner layer of his upper jacket, Marashenko, who had been running around in the flames of war all day, couldn't help but feel a wave of drowsiness. After yawning twice, he immediately hugged his arms and sat back in his position as the captain, falling asleep. The rising sun of June shines like a golden wheat field, breaking free from the shackles of darkness and sprinkling the earth. Feeling the slightly glaring sunlight shining into his eyes, Marashenko, who had been hastily fighting in the tank all night, finally woke up to the call of driver Sielyusha. Comrade Malashenko, we have all heard that you have been promoted to captain and become the captain of our company. Congratulations. Struggling with a slightly sore hunched body, Marashenko straightened his waist from his seat, and before his drowsiness had completely dissipated, he reached out and took the black bread, which was only slightly larger than his fist, from Sielyusha's hand and put it into his mouth. The so-called promotion and wealth during the war period is actually a deadly talisman, Sielyusha. Sometimes you can take on this position not because of your strong talent and abilities, but because the people who were suitable for this position before you have almost died, leaving only you. Therefore, based on the principle of selecting the taller one among the shorter ones, you are sent up. That's all. Putting the last small piece of bread left in his hand into his mouth, Marashenko continued after licking the crumbs left on his fingers, unwilling to waste even a little bit of food. Perhaps one day you will face the same promotion as me, Sielyusha. But please remember, you must never forget about this kind of promotion in war and some so-called false titles. The bullets and shells flying towards you will not matter whether you are a soldier or a general. Life is only once for each of us. After listening to the heartfelt words spoken by Malashenko, he nodded vaguely. The young driver Sielyusha, who had only been in the military for less than a year, clearly had a lot to learn. By the way, sir, when you were resting last night, the field maintenance team had already repaired the damaged armor of our tank. I saw that you were resting in the tank, so I didn't wake you up. I didn't expect that the loud noise during welding didn't wake you up, it was really an accident. After hearing Sielyusha's slightly excited words, a big question mark immediately appeared on Malashenko's head, which was puzzled by the second monk. Welding repaired armor. Didn't you wake me up yet? What's going on here? End of this chapter.